William James is one of the principal figures of modern Anglo-American philosophy. And pragmatism, the philosophical movement that he championed, is certainly one of the most important and enduring philosophical projects of the last 100 years. Now, I would argue that in many ways we could think of James' pragmatism as the American version of Nietzsche's perspectivalism or perspectivism. And indeed, there are a lot of similarities between the thought of James and Nietzsche. They had similar influences, interests, and even views about philosophy, truth, and being or metaphysics. Both were great fans of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Both were profoundly affected by the Darwinian moment and Darwinian revolution in scientific thought. Both were attracted and schooled in idealism and romanticism. And perhaps most interestingly, neither had a technical philosophic training. As you'll remember, Nietzsche was a philologist trained in classical languages. James was a Harvard-educated doctor and one of the founders of modern psychology, who then later on took up an interest in philosophic speculation. As regards their interests, both looked at philosophy from an intensely psychological perspective. In particular, religious psychology fascinated both figures. James, in fact, wrote two important books which dealt with those issues, one generally in the Principles of Psychology, and the second in his famous Varieties of Religious Experience. There is, however, some difference between them. Nietzsche was what we might call a philosophical psychologist, which is to say, Nietzsche was interested in the philosophical implications to be derived from particular psychological states. James, by contrast, was a psychological philosopher. He was interested in the psychological implications of various philosophical positions. But again, as I've mentioned, there are some commonalities between their views, and maybe that's a good way of getting some rough handle on what pragmatism is about. Both are perspectivalists, which is to say, both are anti-realists, both in their interpretation of the external world as well as the internal world. Both see reality as essentially unfinished and in some sense chaotic. And both perceive truth not as a copy of reality, but as a tool that a particular species uses to grapple with natural problems. And again, and perhaps most importantly, both see metaphysics not as a doctrine about the nature of reality, but really ultimately as a sort of spiritual consolation and projection of a lonely animal in an isolated universe. The difference lies in the way both spin their perspectivalism, which is to say, Nietzsche sees the lack of absolute truth as opening up the possibility, at least in his case, of an almost morbid fascination with cruelty, elitism, and a snobbish contempt for the herd. James, by contrast, sees the exact same state of affairs, the lack of absolute truth, and instead sees that as a sort of philosophic charter to embrace tolerance, openness, and democratic egalitarianism. And we can even see this difference reflected in the idiom they'll use to describe the insights of perspectivism or pragmatism. Nietzsche refers to truth as following the power principle, right? Sentences are true if they help us fulfill our will to power. James, the American and perhaps the celebrator of American economic life, says a true sentence has cash value. It helps us get a purchase on reality. Nietzsche looks for truth as a way of allowing us to achieve domination rather than purchase. For Nietzsche, truth, since it's not absolute, is a lie or a great useful error. James also acknowledges that truth is not absolute, but instead says that it is nonetheless serviceable or helpful. And one might indeed think of this as two philosophers looking at the same philosophic situation, and one seeing the glass as half empty and the other as half full. So what I would urge then is, from an American perspective, we think of James' pragmatism as a sort of Americanized, and I would urge in some way adult form of Nietzsche's adolescent insight into perspectivalism. Put briefly, by the time we've come to James, we are no longer scandalized by the loss of absolute truth or a God's eye point of view. which does not mean, however, that we must turn to ruthless recklessness, but just the opposite, to an even more careful and cautious calculation. Well, I want to argue that this sort of democratic ethos, which suffuses James' works, is best exemplified, in fact, in the rhetoric of the text of Pragmatism. The text actually originated as a series of lectures that were delivered at the Lowell Institute in Boston in 1906 and in the following year at Columbia. This is significant because the audience was, in fact, mixed, not only including professionally trained philosophers, but a fairly large number of laypersons. And the text is really pitched more to those laypersons than to the professionals. And it's for that reason that Pragmatism is one of the most accessible and pleasant works in 20th century philosophy. And while this strategy may have led to a lot of derision from philosophers who saw the text as therefore sort of fluffy and light, James believed that in fact it was the average person, the educated layperson, who was and ought be the ultimate judge of philosophical issues. And I quote from the first lecture, "The finally victorious way of looking at things will be the most completely impressive way to the normal run of minds." Okay. So what I want to do in this lecture is look at 4 different issues. First, how does James open this discussion? How does he present to us a way of interpreting the history of philosophy and philosophic disputation? Then we turn to look at what James meant by pragmatism, and we'll see he meant by it both a method and a genetic theory of truth. Then we'll explore how James deploys that method to resolve metaphysical issues and disputes, and finally how James expands that theory of truth in what he calls a pragmatic or instrumental fashion. So let's begin with the way James introduces us to philosophic speculation. He did it in his opening lecture, which was entitled "The Present Dilemma in Philosophy." And James, I would argue quite controversially, interprets the long-standing philosophical dispute that we've seen emerge since the 17th century between, on the one hand, the rationalist and German idealist continental tradition and the empiricist, positivist traditions associated with Anglo-America, as fundamentally a clash of temperament between 2 different sorts of philosophical natures, those he calls the tender and tough-minded. Now, the tender-minded, and by this he means the rationalists and German idealists, are those who, he argues, are influenced by principles, hence their rationalism. They tend to be intellectualistic. They tend to be idealistic. They tend to be optimistic, religious in their orientation. They stress the importance of free will. They tend to be metaphysically monistic, trying to unify the universe under one simple overarching principle. And of course, they tend to be, in his mind at least, dogmatic. Their contrast, the empiricists are, rather than arguing based on principles, tend to refer to facts and are therefore sensationalistic, in the sense that our senses are what they use to build up our knowledge of the world. The world that they build then tends to be materialistic, which results in the very opposite of optimism: pessimism, irreligion, fatalism, pluralism, and finally skepticism. And James shows that each of these different postures or temperaments and philosophical traditions that emerge from them have their virtues and vices. The tender-minded are inspiring. They produce systems that fill us with awe and offer cosmological promise, but at an expense, the expense of one's scientific conscience. They demand that we believe in principles which violate our most advanced scientific understanding. The tough-minded preserve that scientific conscience, but at the expense of religion, hope, and psychological well-being. Indeed, one of the arguments that James adduced both here and in Varieties of Religious Experience is that the tough-minded position for certain souls, those he considered sensitive and sick, and he didn't mean that in a pejorative sense, he was one of those souls, melancholic, that such a position leads to psychological ennui and depression. His point is that the rational person, that well-educated layperson who's not a trained philosopher, wants the good things on both sides of the dispute. right? They want to have their cake and eat it too. And that's when he introduces pragmatism as the means of achieving both of these goals. And I quote, "Most of us have a hankering for the good things on both sides of the line. Facts are good, of course. Give us lots of facts. But principles are good. Give us plenty of principles. The world is undoubtedly one if you look at it in one way, but it is as indubitably it is many if you look at it in another. Everything, of course, is necessarily determined, and yet, of course, our wills are free. A sort of free will determinism is the true philosophy." Okay. So, having laid out this as sort of the overarching way of interpreting philosophy, and it's a very psychological interpretation, I want now to turn to what James meant by pragmatism, that which would allow us to draw on the best on both sides of that table. Well, for James, pragmatism is both a method and a theory of truth. The method grows out of the work of Charles Saunders Peirce in the 19th century. Peirce had offered a pragmatic account of meaning that had argued that the meaning of an expression is determined by the experiences or consequences that would ensue under certain very specific conditions if it were true. Okay. And James paraphrases this in the following passage. "What difference would it practically make to anyone if this notion rather than that notion were true? If no practical difference whatever can be traced, then the alternatives mean practically the same thing, and all dispute is idle. Whenever a dispute is serious, we ought to be able to show some practical difference that must follow from one side or the other's being right." So the way the pragmatic account of meaning then is you interpret a sentence based on the consequences we should expect under discrete circumstances if that sentence were true. Now what James does with this account of meaning is generalize it into a sort of overarching method of settling metaphysical disputes and interpreting philosophical doctrines. Such views and doctrines, in short, theories, are instruments of action according to James, not fixed and final answers to metaphysical enigmas. Okay. The other part of pragmatism for James is pragmatism as a theory of truth. And this was, in fact, largely developed by C.S.F. Schiller and, after James, John Dewey. And it is what I have referred to before as a genetic theory of truth, where truth is something that happens to an idea or belief. To put it briefly, we invent new truths to cope with anomalous experiences. And such invention is limited by the desire to change as few of our old beliefs as possible and conserve appearances. This is a notion we'll see later developed by Quine as a web of belief. So true beliefs for James, then, are those that effectively marry or wed new experiences to our old stock of truths, or beliefs, which we could refer to in the largest sense as common sense. And I quote, "The true is the name of whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief, and good, too, for definite, assignable reasons." Okay. So now what I'd like to do is apply, or see how, rather, James applies the pragmatic method to several long-standing metaphysical problems and disputes. The first one we're going to look at is that dispute between materialism and spiritualism that had become really critical in the 17th century, 18th, and 19th centuries. James argues that if we look at the question of materialism and spiritualism retrodictively, which is to say with an eye to our past experiences, practically, pragmatically, there really is no difference between the two doctrines. And his argument is either posit materialism or spiritualism can account for all the phenomena that have occurred to date. We can account for the natural history of the world on scientific principles, i.e. materialism, the motion of matter following the laws that physics have discovered, or we can account for it on spiritualist lines by invoking the notion of a providential deity. We might not be satisfied with either account, but both accounts are logically consistent and coherent, and therefore both will account for all of our past experience. So in that sense, it may seem to be a rather arid metaphysical discussion. But if we think about the future, i.e. think about these doctrines prospectively, there's a world of difference. Materialism teaches us that ultimately our sun will supernova and our planet will be destroyed. That ultimately our universe will collapse in on itself. And with it, all our aspirations and projects will have meant nothing and will have been permanently obliterated. So materialism prospectively means a cutting off of hope. Spiritualism, on the other hand, means that there is some ground of hope that somehow and somewhere our achievements and examples will persist, if only in the mind of God. Let me quote James. Here then lie the real meanings of materialism and spiritualism, not in hair-splitting abstractions about matter's inner essence or about the metaphysical attributes of God. Materialism means simply the denial that the moral order is eternal and the cutting off of ultimate hopes. Spiritualism means the affirmation of an eternal moral order and the letting loose of hope. Surely here is an issue genuine enough. I want to pause and note something. James has said what this dispute hangs on. He's not taken a choice for us. He's not resolved this dispute. That is for each individual to do for themselves. Okay. James then engages the famous dispute about free will. Are our wills autonomous, or are they determined in a causally necessary order? Now, traditionally, philosophers have tried to argue this dispute in terms of the question of moral culpability and punishment. The free willists will argue that if we are causally determined to do all the acts we do, then we are not in fact responsible for those acts, but the causes of our acts are responsible for our acts. Those who take the opposite position have, like Hume, argued that in fact if we're not causally determined to act the way we do, then there's no reason to suspect that our acts will be replicated in the future, and therefore punishment for crimes is just a sort of perverse vengeance. James thinks that this way of engaging the question of free will and determinism is absurd. In practical terms, the real question of culpability and punishment is resolved not by metaphysics, not by philosophers, but by policemen, lawyers, and courtrooms. They take care of these issues. What then does the issue hang on for James? At least for some people, determinism means that the future will resemble the present and the past. And this again can lead to pessimism and despair. Free will, on the other hand, pragmatically means that we can expect novelties in the future. And I quote, "Free will pragmatically means novelties in the world, the right to expect that in its deepest elements as well as in its surface phenomena, the future may not identically repeat and imitate the past. It holds up, therefore, improvement as at least possible, whereas determinism assures us that our whole notion of possibility is born of human ignorance." So for James, the whole point of free will is to make it possible for us to believe, in some sense, that the world can be made better. A doctrine that James calls meliorism, in contrast to either optimism or pessimism. And again, James has not resolved the dispute. He's simply shown what the critical issues are. We must decide each of these issues for ourselves. Okay. The third issue that James engages is the question of God or design. And it, again, just like in the other cases, has no retrodictive force. The past can be accounted for by believing in God and design or by simply believing in the random motion of atoms. But again, its difference is in our understanding of our future. If we believe in God or design, it assures us, that doctrine, that everything ultimately will work out in the wash, that ultimately good will triumph in the universe. And for James, this is important because if we believe that there is no God and there is no design, then each individual is responsible for the moral order of his life and the world that surrounds him. Which, for James, being the American can-do sort of character he is, that means that we almost always have to be in a moral huff. We almost always have to be engaged in moral action, precisely to safeguard the moral nature of our universe. But if we believe in God and design, we know that even if we're not constantly acting out our moral agendas, ultimately everything will finally work out, which allows us to take a moral holiday, to occasionally leave morality at the doorstep and enjoy aesthetics or whatever other experiences we find fulfilling. And I quote, "Our interest in religious metaphysics arises in the fact that our empirical future feels to us unsafe and needs some higher guarantee. And the belief in God and design is pragmatically, nothing more than a source of such a guarantee, a reason for us to feel confident that ultimately right will win out." And again, James has not said one ought to believe in God. That's a question for each individual and each individual temperament to resolve for him or herself. Well, James concludes this sort of analysis of the pragmatic use of pragmatism as method by arguing that the deployment of this kind of method really represents for him what he calls a philosophical Protestant Reformation, or rebellion against authority on behalf of the individual, each individual being empowered to judge for himself what metaphysical notions he needs or she needs to live a full and richly rewarding life. And he compares this to the philosophical revolution, the Protestant Reformation, which also insisted on the priesthood of all believers, that each soul must face God without the mediation of a church. And as he notes, "And as to papal minds, Protestantism has often seemed a mere mess of anarchy and confusion. Such, no doubt, will pragmatism often seem to ultra-rationalistic minds in philosophy. It will seem so much mere trash, philosophically. But life wags on, all the same, and compasses its ends in Protestant countries. I venture to think that philosophical Protestantism will compass a not dissimilar prosperity." Okay. I want now to turn to that last issue, the pragmatic account of truth, which James took up at the end of his series, where he turned to a much more rich and complete account of what we might call an instrumental theory of truth. The simplest way of putting it is that, like Nietzsche, James rejected the correspondence or copy theory of truth. That doctrine had held that your ideas are true when they are accurate representations or copies of the objects that they are about. So if I was to hold up, say, a coffee mug, and you took a look at it, and then closed your eyes and had an idea of it, that would be if it was more or less an accurate depiction of this, you would have the truth. It would be a copy. And James says, well, in that sense, you can see intuitively why the notion of copy works. But suppose I was to say to you, don't just get an idea of the coffee mug, get an idea of the structure, the molecular and atomic structure of the coffee mug. Well, you get that idea in your head, it's quite likely you have a pretty reasonable conception of what that would be. It's also quite clear there is no sense in which you could have a sort of representation or image of that. Right? There's no way you could picture that. And his point is that that's not what, in fact, truth does. It doesn't picture. It helps us get a grasp on things. In this sense, we might think of sentences or beliefs as not so much copies of the world that are true eternally if they mirror the world, but rather as principles which allow us to manipulate the world and are therefore made true by verification. And I quote, "True ideas are those that we can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. False ideas are those that we cannot. Truth happens to an idea. It becomes true, is made true by events." So true beliefs are in fact instruments of actions, not copies of the world or thoughts in God's mind. In this sense, we might think of truth as a primitive term, a term which cannot in fact be defined, in the same way that good is for a pragmatist a primitive term, a term that can't be defined. Right? Good is a compliment one pays to actions. When one says an action is good, one enjoins others to copy it. Similarly, the true is the expedient in the way of belief. It is a compliment we pay to beliefs. This belief is working, therefore we call it true, just as the good is in the way of action. And both true and good, right, are applied for specific and definite reasons. Now, there are some important implications of this doctrine. First, this destroys any conception we might have of absolute truth, except maybe as a normative ideal that we might ultimately all believe in at some end time. But perhaps more importantly, James argues, this theory really is the first humanistic interpretation of truth. And know why he would think that. First, it tells us that the world is not a fixed given that we must correspond to. Right? So we must not, in fact, subject ourselves to the world to get truth. Just the opposite. It follows the essential credo of humanism. Man is the measure of the world. Truths exist for us and by us. Okay. Therefore, we say that the world is, in fact, made over in our image by our truths. And what does that mean? Well, what he's pointing out is, the same as Nietzsche had in Perspectivism, that our truths are embedded in sentences. The terms of those sentences parse our experience. That for an infant, for example, the world does not come parsed into objects like coffee mugs, lecterns, and ties. He experiences it as a boomin', buzzin' confusion. It's our language that helps him reify the world into the objects that we name. And in that way, as we produce new names and new conceptual schemes, we change the nature of our universe. We once believed that all objects were made exclusively of substances. Then we came to believe that they were made up of a prime substance, matter. Some physicists might tell us today that they're not in fact made up of matter at all. They're ultimately made up of energy, that's the ultimate posit. And his point is that we remake the world every time we come up with one of these new conceptual schemes. We make the truth as well as the falsehood. As Nietzsche would say, all our beliefs are human, all too human. But James puts it in a different way. He says, the trail of the human serpent is over all. And that's the essence of the humanist insight, that you can't separate the human contribution from the world is as it is in and of itself. And again, our point is that we have no awareness of a world prior to our interpretation of it under some description or some conceptual scheme. The pre-schematic phenomenal world of philosophers is itself an abstraction from experience. In and of itself, our experience without our language and conceptual categories would simply be a state of chaos and flux. Again, by naming things and properties, we break up the flux of experience. We parse it and humanize it, by which we mean to say we make it serviceable and useful for our human biological, social, and psychological needs. The implication of that is that our culture constantly is changing or mutating in an almost Darwinian fashion according to our changing dictates and needs. So beliefs are called true when they have a survival value for us. And we could think of common sense as simply the fund of such beliefs that had a survival value that are still working for us. They are the set of effective beliefs and posits that still pass muster. Now, James defends such perspectivalism or anti-realism of pragmatism against his rationalist foes. As he says, now the idea of this loose universe affects your typical rationalists in much the same way as freedom of the press might affect a veteran official in the Russian Bureau of Censorship. It affects him as the swarm of Protestant sects affect the papist, onlooker. In other spheres of life, it is true that we have got used to living in a state of relative insecurity. The authority of the state and that of an absolute moral law have resolved themselves into experiences. And Holy Church has resolved itself into meeting houses. Not so as yet within the philosophical classrooms. And that is, in fact, the goal of pragmatism, and I hope I gave you some sense of how James thought that that would in fact be fulfilled. By leaving solutions open, by simply proposing a method and an understanding of our truth, it allows each individual to choose, whether tough-minded or tender-minded, how best to square their experiences with the fund of beliefs that they have inherited.